My name is Ishan Kumar. I'm from Ping. I'm in product management. I focus on our Ping 1 IDaaS solution strategy. And today I want to talk about people. So product management, if you're not familiar with the role, deals with a lot with personas. And personas in the identity industry have typically been talked about security professionals, IAM pros, end users, and I think an increasing audience that we're going to be spending a lot of time in the next several years is a developer. How many of you consider yourselves a developer in your organization? How many of you work with developers? Right. How many of you like developers? Don't answer that question. And I want to get into the motivations of a developer, right? I think that part of where we have to evolve as an industry and kind of considerations is there's a new audience that's emerging that have always played an identity but have always been on the fringe, right? And I want to spend a little bit of time, so it's not going to be a technical presentation. There's some content that refers to like technical concepts, but mainly it's about people, right? I want to talk about people. So a little different take. So developers get really excited about new apps, very complex problems, coming up with elegant solutions, and ultimately they want to see their app successful, right? And there are a lot of components that go into that that make that possible. And identity is one of them, right? There is a necessary component, and in some cases can be a business value add, but oftentimes it's something that say, well, I have to do security, right? I have to protect the application. I have to identify people, right? In an ideal world, we would love to be able to walk up to any digital interface and it tell us who we are, right? It's not type in credentials, password, MFA. All these experiences detract from the fact that the application, the core value prop that they want, is there. And a byproduct of all of these applications is data, right? And developers don't necessarily want to spend the time building out the infrastructure around it, right? They just want to be able to create data, consume data, modify data, and move forward. And typically these developers work for a large enterprise, right, that have a broader set of use cases, right? And so it's nice I'm working on my little app, right? I'm going to get it finished, rolled out, and then guess what? I have to worry about encryption. I have to worry about, do I scale to millions? Is my infrastructure scaled to millions? I'm not going to know about whether that happens or not. How do I do single sign-on? What is single sign-on? How do I federate? OpenID Connect? There's a presentation, right, about the OpenID spec and all the different hundreds of pages you have to read to get familiar with it. And then oftentimes there's an ecosystem within a large enterprise you have to connect to and comply with. Right? It's not easy. Right? There's a lot that goes into developing an app and having a successful application that people have to take into account. And developers at the center of it. Right? They have security folks coming in, they have their business counterparts coming in talking about it. And what they have available typically to them is their kind of stack, right? And given a developer, do it yourself. If you ever talk to a developer about somebody else's code, right? It's never good enough, right? They can always nitpick, right? And same thing, right? They'd rather have control, right? And I think all of us resonate with that, right? If we're building an application, critical customer facing, we want a level of control. And we think that it's better for us to do it rather than rely on somebody else. They've gone through the process of creating login before, right? May not be to our specifications or what we consider best practice, but they've done it. Right? But once you get into login, you have to store passwords. How do you store passwords, securely on Mongo or in SQL? Right? If you have a password, you have to have a password policy. If you typically have users that forget their passwords, account recovery, right? You start getting into an interesting maze of complications that you have to factor in and spend a significant amount of time. Another presentation yesterday, right, on developers, Atlassian, if you were there for that. They decided to build their own. A number of years ago, they had a team of 60 developers just focusing on managing and keeping their identity system up to date. And they're a big company, and they have 3 or 4 applications, but it's massive, right? That's a significant investment. It's not easy. And developers are constantly engaged with the business, right? They're talking to their counterparts. They're trying to figure out what's the next new app, what's the experience that they want. Business users or business counterparts want to know who the users are, right? The data, the personas, what their interests, how they're using the application, extremely valuable. Security, on the other hand, is coming and saying, well, you have to make sure that they do not get access in certain scenarios or that they step up, right, so that you use MFA or you ask them for their passwords again so that the session is fresh, right, especially if they're doing a transaction, it involves monetary amount or exchanging monetary for value or for a product. developers are trying to figure out what's the right sequence of events. On one hand, they're hearing, identity or security is a friction point, whether it's registration, hey, filling in a long form, going through a multi-step process before an account's created. And on the other hand, they're like, well, we're dealing with fraudulent accounts that are being created to that form. How do we reconcile the two, right? And there's technology that's out there, but it's not for a developer, right? It's typically for an infrastructure team to deploy into a space and say, hey, we'll create it into the architecture, right? Rather than saying, well, what does the application developer really need to consume that service and build it into their application? And from their perspective, they would rather have a platform, right? They can handle the requirements. They understand how to do that all day long. They build software. They just need a platform to stand on from an identity perspective to go forward with. And that application will evolve, right? There's phases to not only just like if you think of SDLC as a kind of a minor process on top of a larger business process, or underneath a larger business process, right? That application and requirements that just do as simple as login. This is safe for an app, a new market, an application, to all the way managing sessions, degrading over time, to stepping it up when required, to how do I incorporate risk services, right? Today, they're all separate infrastructure components built for a different audience, right? And today, we need to start talking about how we transition that over for a developer. And they have guidelines, right? There's been a significant amount of effort in the security space to talk about what is application security, what are best practices, right? Most of you are probably familiar and probably have these conversations with your developers around what should you be looking for. We have tools like pen tests to go validate. We have code scans that you can do, library scans. There's a ton of tools out there built for the developer. And then you go into the identity space, right, and you see a bunch of infrastructure, right? Applications that are already been built for a different audience. And a lot of the transition that's happening, the application is going to be outside of these walled gardens, right? More and more of that expectation around applications is moving out. So while all those things on the right are true, or on your left is true, the perimeter, the mechanism in which they protect these applications is now being centered around the identity, right? So as you consider all the different kind of variations that identity will be involved with and engaged with, it starts becoming the focal point of how you protect applications in the future. And if you take that a step further, I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that you may start simple, right, with a login, but they're connected, right? To get a login, you have to register. To register, you have to have verified your account. Once you've verified your account, it creates, well, do you have access to your profile? How do you manage your profile? If you can manage your profile, do you add MFA devices? If you have account recovery set up, you do that to your MFA, do you do that to your password? Every user is a little bit different, right? Some audiences may have a mobile app, some don't, so I have to have different variations of all the different possibilities of authentication. And they're not simple, right? We spend a lot of time at Ping thinking about, what are the variations that authentication, registration, account recovery that you have to build, and for the different constituents that you have to interact with. And if you do it all within a web experience or something that's hosted within a product or software container, you get very restricted. And even we asked the question around logout. What happens specifically when you log out? Do just the session end? What about your tokens? What about data that was passed in between applications? Like all that question opened up where developers just heads explode, right? It's not something that they typically have to deal with. And so that all transitions to the fact that the industry is going to start shifting, right? I imagine when I ask that question 2 years, 3 years from now, there'll be a lot more developers in the audience. I think you'll see a lot more platforms that are coming out from an identity perspective, where today developers have platforms for infrastructure, platforms for data, platforms for code, right? Running code into your applications. That there will be an identity platforms that are out there that allow you to integrate these into the applications very specifically. But they have specific needs, right? And I'll go back to the persona of control, right? They want to be in the driver's seat when it comes to their application. They're the ones that want to make sure they have the right level of kind of interaction with any of their components, and they'll pick solutions based on that level of control, right? They'll make recommendations. If they can work with it, right? If they can drive how they interact, how they integrate that application, it's going to be a key factor for them. So one is, how do you consume, right? Is it easy to understand? How do I have access, right? Are there separation of roles versus admin versus developer? Do you have the right distinctions? A persona, right? We talk product management, we talk about personas. Does your platform understand my persona, who I am, what my needs are? And then you get into control, right? And I have multiple options of control because, again, a developer works in a life cycle of their application. They may be in a dev environment. If I'm quickly iterating, building my app, should I have to call somebody for access? Right? It's going to slow me down. That's not something that I want. I'm under constant time pressure to build my application, and I don't need to call somebody to get access and build my application, specifically in a dev environment. Now the expectations change as you go through test, stage, into production, right? And so your platform should be able to accommodate how the access control changes based on the context in which they're operating. The next kind of level of, let's say, evaluation is that, do you understand the platform I'm building, right? Go back to FLAMP versus Mean. There's a bunch of others that people are building applications around. Does your code accommodate that? Does it fit the pattern that I look for, that I use? Right? So your APIs have to really understand those kind of practices that are out there and design for how applications build their apps so it makes sense. If you're a snowflake or something that appears as a one-off, you're not going to last very long. Onboarding, right? Identity, I spoke earlier, right? It's not something that they inherently work with every day. They have a ton of different areas that they cover. If you think about a full stack developer, identity is not one of those things that show up in a full stack development skill set, right? So what is your documentation? Can I learn about your APIs? Do you have training available? How do you help me get onboarded with samples, right? Get me working on it within my application as quickly as possible, and then I'll learn from there. Start small and I'll expand. Do you understand that development process? And then finally, data services, right? And I've talked about one of the byproducts of applications and the amount of information that's being created is that I don't have to, with an identity, I shouldn't have to worry about the infrastructure behind it. I should be able to scale, right? Should be able on a per user basis be able to add as much data as I need or as many identities as I need, right? And that's a significant challenge, right? That data becomes useful though in a lot of other applications from an identity platform as far as for the developer if you can consume it. They'll always have their Cassandras, they'll have their Mongos, they'll have a bunch of other instances that they can use, but identity is a platform that uniquely, I think, positioned to, on a per user basis, be able to capture a lot of information about the user across applications that can be shared. So one of the things you kind of get past, okay, I've seen your platform, I understand, I have the control that I want, I'm able to integrate to my application in the way that makes sense to me, I can learn your patterns, I can implement it to my application, I can solve the problems that I need around authentication. But now I need to do this 100 times. Is it manual when I have to set up my next application, if I go to my next environment? Do you have administrative APIs exposed for me to go automate the process, right? To registering my application, creating environments, uploading users. Typically are using a number of resources. I have to model those resources in your platform so I can make authorization decisions, or you can make authorization decisions on my behalf, right? And I have to repeat that over and over again. It's ingrained in their personality and the way they've drawn to find patterns. And in their coding practices, if you find a pattern in your logic, you don't repeat it, you reuse it, right? In the same sense, as they go through their development process, they're going to try to automate as much as possible. Your platform has to be able to support that automation so that as they go through their life cycle of development of an app, they're not repeating their work. The next level of kind of evaluation is around your APIs design. They build APIs all the time. They're going to be just as kind of stringent and persnickety about your design, right? Your platform. What standard do you follow? What's your approach? Is it REST? Do you use something archaic like SOAP? Do you use something else, right? And is it something that fits the way they build? Does your URL pattern, right? They're all constantly, again, if you look at an OIDC request or a SAML request, it gets long, right? There's a lot of information that can be passed through that, and there's a lot of handshakes back and forth. Can I follow that? Does it make sense, right? They have to troubleshoot. They have to understand how the application is working in testing and development. If it's something that they can follow, it makes it easier for them to get their application up and running. The resource model. In a platform, there's going to be a lot of objects, right? You talk about configuration, you talk about identity, you talk about devices, and they'll have various permutations depending on how you structure your organization. or your hierarchy. Is that something that can be sophisticated enough where you have multiple layers, right? So we talk about, even from a configuration perspective, let's just say you have define an application, right? What other components underneath the application can you define? Is it how you do your OIDC configuration, or are you going somewhere else and I'm doing a reference? What about your attribute transformations, right? What about the schema for the application? What about the scopes or resources or the assertions and claims? How is that all resources? Am I going to one spot to manage all that, the policies associated with the application, or am I bouncing around and doing a lot of references? It matters. The language of those objects matter as well, right? Increasingly, I'm sure you're familiar with JSON, but that's what they expect, right? They have interpreters today for JSON. It's something that they can reuse and parse out information that they need. And finally, where I think an area within identity, which I think a number of you have probably heard talks on, is around relationships between objects, right? In the real world, right, and which is what developers spend a lot of time trying to model, is that a device to a person is not one-to-one exclusively, right? A device may have multiple users. How can I model that relationship in your platform? In a person or in society, right, we're part of a household. We have family members. Can I model those relationships between those objects through the API? Right, I think a lot of applications, a lot of business counterparts we're talking to want to see that within their systems because those relationships are meaningful in development of their business. And they're looking for APIs around identity to connect the dots. Finally, well, not finally, but kind of the next level is, do you actually protect my application, right? Do you provide the right level of authentication services that allows me to ensure or be assured that you're the identity that is being asserted? Do you have the notion of sessions, right? Does your platform allow me to manipulate those sessions, right, as I see fit, right? Is it exposed via an API? Subsequently, because I want to be able to step up for highly sensitive transactions. Do you give me that granular level of control, right? Because I'm the one that knows the app. I'm the one that's working with the business directly and understands where we need to provide a higher level of assurance or additional security. And then do you provide services that I probably can't build myself, right? Do you have the background information around devices, people, and their transactions in a more broader ecosystem that could protect my application, right? There's a lot of layers to understanding, do you provide a sense of security in a sense, right, to their application, because you're providing more than what they can build themselves. Now, let's just say you've passed the pattern test, you've given the control, you're confident that, they have confidence that you can protect their application, and now they got to go to production, right? And in production, they're on call, right? They're in charge of their application running well in their environments. Do you have alerts and triggers set up so that I know, is it my app that's causing the problem, my code, or is it your system, right? A lot of times they're responsible for making sure the monitoring is in place so that they know how to quickly troubleshoot, right? And there may be layers. They have SREs or DevOps doing one layer of troubleshooting. They may get called for another layer of troubleshooting. They need to quickly identify where the problem is. And the IAM system is an external dependency, right? So they need to understand the status of that IAM. Is it degraded in any shape, way, or form? What services are working, not working? And do you expose that data, right? They want to automate. They want to make sure they can, if they see a pattern of behavior, can they make that information available and act on it, right? They may be able to restart, re-engage their system in a different way or find an alternative path within their application. They're coders. It's just a matter of exposing that information to them and they'll find a way around. So kind of just broadly, right, that platform concept solves a lot of different use cases. Within even a large enterprise, a single organization, but a large enterprise, we've talked to one recently that said, we have a startup within our organization. We're going to build everything ourselves, right? And we want just APIs. We don't want to interact with any part of the system other than the APIs. To the other extreme is like, well, I know my identity use case is simple. I don't want to build the UIs. I want to offload the experience to you, brand it, right? But let me just manage the applications. You're a central service to everything in between, right? I think as applications evolve, you can reasonably expect there's no one pattern that will fit well with the developer, and your platform has to be able to scale out as they evolve from their perspective. And just more generally, right, if you talk to developers, security is hard. It's not a core competency, there's a small set of people that they focus on application security. But generally finding people that have that background, if you think about it, can you remember the last time an application didn't prompt you to log in or didn't let register? Identity is core to every single application that's out there, right? But yet we find a gap in the market where we are today and where people kind of expect to move in the future. And that's also with us as a community, right? IAM professionals aren't developers necessarily. We don't necessarily engage in that persona. We don't necessarily build apps. We provide infrastructure, and someone consumes them. And so we have a challenge of companies have a challenge of finding IAM professionals enough so that they can supply and meet their demands and needs. And IAM, we kind of live in this dual world. We want to push the edge of where IAM is going and be able to assert from a technology perspective, but when you talk to a lot of organizations, especially large enterprises, they're still kind of coming along. So there's a gap where IAM is evolving to be a very complicated, sophisticated system, but companies are reticent to move forward because of the complexity. And so I think part of the conversation and tapping into a new audience is being able to bring IAM to the forefront of the conversation and understanding that it's at the center of security of your application, and understanding that there's platforms that are available for you to kind of build that in without having to be an IAM expert. And what they want to get back to is coding, right? They want to build the core business value, their logic, and they have a lot of other concerns and constraints that they're working against. Not only just getting the application out the door and running, but the resiliency, to be able to scale around the world, performance, right? There's a whole slew of things that they have to kind of iterate through before they even talk about identity. So if we can remove that obstacle for them, we really can speed up their application development processes. Because a lot of times, a lot of the barriers around getting their application out the door, they build the app first and then think about identity. And we need to shift that transition. Identity needs to be a core part of the process of being built into how they go. So just keep that in mind. It's like platform, right? They want to be reused. They want to automate. They want to have a community of people that understand what their challenges are and how they help. And finally, the security aspects of that we have to be able to protect their applications. They have to understand how that works. So, kind of went quick, but that was my quick talk on developers and personas. Thank you. I'm here. Ask questions. We got. I'm not sure how much time we have because we have a broken clock here. Or I'm at the booth if you want to come by and talk about what Ping's working on a developer front. Thank you.